up, everyone? Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, a competitor's guide to mental health and mastery. My name is Paul Klingen, and I'm your host. Hope you guys are all enjoying your holidays and are taking some time off to spend it with some loved ones and family. And also thank you for spending your free time listening to this podcast. I've been really excited to release it. Today I've got Eddie Stern on. And for those of you that don't know Eddie, recently he released a book, One Simple Thing, A New Look at Science of Yoga and How It Can Transform Your Life. And if you've been listening to this podcast, you know how influential yoga was on my career path and my life journey. But what I love about this book and his work is he takes the two things that sometimes don't speak the same language, where science and studies, and then on the other side you have yoga and spirituality and things that may not be measurable. And I really appreciate it because when I try and blend, athletics and yoga, sports and athletics is always about numbers and stats, but then there's the spiritual and the intangibles and the things that you don't have numbers for, but you just know is real. And his book does a really incredible job at looking at a bunch of different things and explaining them from a science lens, but then helping to incorporate yoga into that. And sometimes it's vice versa, but it's a really deep podcast, a really interesting podcast with a ton of knowledge. And he's a really smart guy with a deep background in both Ashtanga yoga and the science behind it. So excited for you guys to listen to this. But without further ado, here we go. Eddie Stern. What's up, Eddie? Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. Eddie, your book has been super illuminating to me just because as someone who comes from an athletic background, and a lot of that is rooted in Western science and where's the data, where's this, and then to go and, articulate how yoga is so beneficial to an athlete or to someone who maybe doesn't see the spiritual or the mental or the physical benefits of it. Your book really did a good job in kind of arming me to have the ability to articulate that and cross that bridge. First of all, thank you so much for writing that book. I can tell you put a lot of research into it. I think the first question I just want to ask is, one, what inspired you to write that book, and when did you kind of realize that that was a topic you want to discover and a bridge that you wanted to help others cross?
Well, I first started exploring first of all, thank you very much for the kind words. And I'm really happy the book's been helpful for you. I am, I love yoga, and it's really helped me a lot in my life. And I also really have deep affection for humanity. And I think that these practices are helpful for human beings in general, and the odd animal who comes onto a yoga mat every once in a while. So I think that access to these practices is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to make access to these practices easier and accessible is a very important thing. And different types of people are going to respond in different ways to the information they receive. Some people are very scientific. Some people don't need science. They just need their feelings and their intuition.
Yeah.
They don't need a lot of explanation. They just need to be told what to do. And they'll go for it. And other people, they like a little more explanation, and they want some data, or they want some understanding of how it works, and then maybe they'll do it. So I think in my book, I was trying to address kind of both of those things. In the first half, I wanted to give some basic yoga philosophy information for the people who don't really need data, but they like the idea that something they're doing comes from a wisdom tradition.
Yeah.
The second half of the book was for the people who really enjoy data. I also enjoy that too. I enjoy both sides equally.
Yeah.
So what led me to write it was first, what led me to think about it was probably a very long trajectory. And we don't have a lot of time, so I won't go through the whole trajectory. But there was a conference called the Ashtanga Yoga Confluence that used to be held in San Diego. And I went to it for several years in a row. And the last year that I went, they asked me if I'd like to give a lecture on something. And I said, I'd like to talk about the correlates between the Eastern and Western ideas of the nervous system. Because I was really beginning to look into that. And a great way to learn more about something is to talk about it.
Yeah.
Especially to a group of people. You're going to be challenged. So I started getting heavy into research, and that lecture led to a really long PowerPoint presentation that I then refined and worked on in lectures for like the next 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years. And then that eventually turned into this book.
That's incredible. So it sounds like you did a lot of study and a lot of time went into this. You mentioned the nervous system and Just going to jump right into this. One of the things that you talk about towards the end of the book is the polyvagal theory. And there's so much talk about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system and how pranayama and different breathing techniques and withdrawal of the senses can help stimulate, either upregulate sympathetic or downregulate um, from how it relates to yoga and how that can be beneficial to someone who struggles with mental health or trauma. How does the polyvagal theory kind of explain the three levels, and then what are the different techniques within the different asanas or breathing or meditation that can help to stimulate and help people deal with some of those things that they're going through?
Okay, so this is like a huge topic. Dr. Stephen Porges, who is the scientist who proposed the polyvagal theory, basically said that our vagus nerve has three different branches. And the vagus nerve is one of the oldest branches of our nervous system. It's the biggest bundle of nerves in the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system has something like 300, particularly in the brainstem, actually, has like 320 million years of evolution. So this is really, really ancient. And so the ancient structures in us have helped us to survive by perceiving threat and moving towards safety. So hardwired into who we have developed into as people is the ability to survive. That's why we're still here. Um, and our nervous system is helping us to navigate the things of the world around us in such a way that either we live in balance with it or we conquer it when we need to. So the ways that we live in balance are when we are pro-socially engaged and cooperating with people around us and the environment around us. The way that we survive threat is when we flee from it or fight it. And in times of great danger, we immobilize or feign death in order to have, feel utmost safety. So the vagus nerve has sheaths that are myelinated and unmyelinated. The myelinated, that is, passes messages very, very quickly, coming down from the brainstem through the trachea into the heart, lungs, and diaphragm. It's all above the diaphragm. And that's why these myelinated nerves that are also going into the sinoatrial node are helping to control our heart rate, through heart rate variability, basically. The heart beat is being propagated by the cells in the heart. But the vagus nerve is speeding and slowing the heart with our respiration, basically. Now, and then the nerves that are going below the diaphragm are unmyelinated, and those are related to fight or flight when the sympathetic nervous system goes into hyperarousal. That is because the sympathetic nervous system is activated throughout the day, as is our parasympathetic, but it's only at certain times is there dominance from one to the other. When sympathetic goes into dominance or hyperarousal, then we are perceiving threat around us and we are reacting to that threat with a survival instinct. We fight against it or we flee from it. And that could be anything from an email that we think is going to have bad news to alerts coming in on our phones, imagining an argument with someone later on in the afternoon. It doesn't have to be like ISIS or, it could just be turbulence on a plane. Anything during the day that we perceive as a threat can send our sympathetic nervous system into a state of alert. And at that point, then what happens is the parasympathetic nervous system stops, temporarily is impaired. And so if you imagine that the parasympathetic is, for at least going into the heart, is like the brake, and the sympathetic is our accelerator, when we go into hyperarousal, our braking mechanism gets impaired and the accelerator gets pushed down. We speed up, the heart is going boom, 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 boom. And palms get sweaty. We, start to feel maybe flushed in the face or knots in our stomach. All these types of things are associated with that. And little things can set us off. And then feigning death is when, you really fear for your life, that there's nothing you can fight back against. And this immobilization happens from people who are being raped or who are being severely attacked. Where you hear stories of people who are black belts in karate and they get attacked by a man, and and they lose the ability to fight back. And someone will say to them later, "Why didn't you fight back?" And they say, "I couldn't, I was immobilized." So what Stephen Porges says is these responses to the environment are predictable, that our sympathetic nervous system will respond to threat in a predictable way. Our parasympathetic nervous system will respond to safety in a particular way. And immobilization, which is another deep branch of the unmyelinated nerve sheath, will also respond in a predictable way. And so what we want to do is we want to begin to give a measure of control to how we perceive stress and how we perceive threat and how we perceive the environment, so that the world doesn't overtake us, but we know this is actually a safe situation. Or, if we're a person who gets stressed out really easily, if we can shift our stress perception to think, stress is actually good. Stress will help me grow. Stress is a challenge that's going to help me stand on my own 2 feet. It's not something I need to be afraid of. And then, so the things that are really, truly a threat, that those things we can then take action steps towards dealing with in a way that is thoughtful and measured, rather than a way that is like just totally overreactive. And so within the yoga system, we have 4 things which are going to directly target making that shift in perception. And a lot of it has to do with the tone of the vagus nerve. So tone of the vagus nerve means information flows. When there's not good information flows through that nerve, bundle of nerves from the body up to the brain, then the vagus nerve is said to be, there's a weak vagal tone. But when the information flows are really good and the traffic is moving, then it's a high vagal tone. So what can we do to do that? Well, number one, simple things, gratitude, appreciation, feeling of thanks, all those things strengthen vagal tone, feelings of love and kindness. And anger, and complaining, feeling that you've been wronged all the time, and constantly playing the victim and things like that. Those are going to weaken vagal tone. Stephen Porges has identified 4 different things within religious practices as well that tie in exactly to yoga, and he calls them neural exercises. And these are breathing. First is posture. As soon as you sit up straight, what happens is a message is sent to the baroreceptors, which are nerves that wrap around the carotid arteries in the throat, that are monitoring your blood pressure. And then it's sending a signal from the carotid arteries to the brain back down to the heart, saying, something's happening here, pay attention. So posture balances blood pressure. Even just sitting up straight, that has a really positive effect on your blood pressure. And also on the communication system between these baroreceptors and the brain and the heart. So number one is posture. And you find posture used in Islam when it comes to bowing, and in Judaism with davening, and the Sufis, they whirl, and Hindus do the Surya Namaskar. And so all these different, and in church, you'll have to kneel and sit back up. So all these different religious traditions are using posture in one way or another to enhance the relationship you're forming with your devotions. Okay, so the next thing after posture is breathing. In yoga, you have different breathing practices, but even to do vocalization, which is the next one, like chanting or singing or praying, that requires you to extend your exhale as you vocalize. And the extension of the exhale is strengthening for your parasympathetic nervous system. And the strengthening of the exhale is stimulating the vagal brake, which is slowing the heart rate down. So anytime that you want to chant a long phrase or pray a long phrase, not only are you vocalizing, which I'll explain the benefits of in a minute, but you're also having this effect on slowing the heart. And then you have, like, for meditation, you have the rhythmicity of breathing. And when the belly is moving in and out in a slow, easy fashion, it's sending messages of rhythmicity and calmness and steadiness from the vagal nerves in the abdomen up to the brain, telling the brain, you're safe, you're content, everything is smooth now. So the vagus nerve goes through the larynx. So our tone of voice, for example, is going to be changed and regulated through the vagus nerve. As well, we have nuclei from the vagus nerves going to the corner of the mouth, the eyes, and to the ears, attaching to those nerves. So we have vocal expression, articulation, and facial expression, how my eyes are moving and my mouth is moving. You can recognize a smile in my eyes or my mouth. You can hear change of voice. And then through your ears, that's going into your vagus nerve, which is going to process this information and go, oh, he's happy, he's angry, he's loving, he's complimenting me, he's criticizing me. Oh, his voice sounds weird, there's something going on. So what happens is your vagus nerve is going to pick up all this information and help process it in your brain. And my vagus nerve is going to help me to communicate all that to you so that we co-regulate each other and interact with each other because of these nerve plexuses. And this is called co-regulation and social interaction. When the vagus nerve is toned, we can have pro-social interaction because we can hear tone of voice properly and we can read facial expressions properly and we understand what a person is trying to communicate. And then, but this is also very cultural. So when you go to another country, say you go to India and saying yes and no, the head is going like this all the time, and you don't know if they're saying yes or no or what's going on. It becomes like the head bubble is very So a lot of this stuff is cultural as well, agreed upon cultural ways of communicating. So the vagus nerve for vocalization is very important again. And in different traditions, they'll use vocalization in different ways. Last is behavior. We already talked about loving kindness and appreciation and gratitude. In yoga system, we have the yamas, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha. This is not causing harm, telling the truth, not stealing, sexual restraint, and finally, not being greedy. So these are sort of 5 behaviors that people try to abide to the best of their ability within the yoga practices. There's another way of looking at those behaviors, that they are spontaneous displays of an awakened person, that when you're fully awakened, you're not going to cause harm to anyone. You have no need to steal anyone's property because nothing belongs to anybody. All of this is God's world.
Mm-hmm.
And you tell the truth because there's nothing else you can utter, and you don't objectify people sexually or acting sexually inappropriately. And you're not greedy for anything because you own nothing. So those are spontaneous behaviors of an awakened person, but until we get there, we can try to practice those things the best we can in our life. So those 4 things, posture, breathing, vocalization, behavior, are basically the first 4 limbs of Ashtanga yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga. And they tie in really well. And so when I heard him talking about that, my mind was like, holy shit, this is yoga. So I thought, wow, the yogis really knew what to use in order to be kinder, more peaceful, thoughtful, like awakened beings. And nervous system information flows seem to have a lot to do with that, which is why the yogis talked about the nadi system so much. The nervous system in Sanskrit is called the nadi system. Pranayama directly impacts the nadis. That's why you do pranayama, to cleanse the nadis. So in fact, Hatha Yoga, one of the meanings for Hatha Yoga that many people ascribe to it is pranayama, the breathing practices. And the pranayamas all are directly purifying the nadis. That's all they talk about. So yoga at its root, one of the most important parts of the practice is the purification of the nadis, which is our nervous system. The yogis knew that. And now here's a Western way of describing what the yogis already knew in ways that are not, exotic or filled with Sanskrit words.
Yeah.
Or things. It's like, here's a concrete way of looking at what yoga is doing to us. And it's no different than the way that the yogis described it. Simply, we're using Western terminology. That's why I find it really exciting.
Absolutely. And that's why as I was reading through this book, I was like, wow, these are giving me parallels. Like when you were talking about nadi and unilateral breathing and then being able to describe how it affects the different hemispheres of the brain and how we can use that for anxiety. When I've done it in class, initially when I first did it, like when I was first getting into yoga, I was like, all right, why are we breathing out of this? Like last time I did this, I was blowing boogers out. Now I'm breathing in through one nose and out through the other. Obviously, just went over a ton of really interesting information. The part where you mentioned the yamas, I think is super interesting because that's how we have that social engagement. And one of the quotes in that book is, in an enlightened society, people use objects and love people. In our society today, we use people and love objects. And when I heard that, I was listening to it on audiobook, and I was like, "Phew, man, that's so good." When I first got in to yoga studios and was going,
That is a quote from Radhanath Swami.
Mhm.
He's one of the important figures in the Hare Krishna movement, and he runs a big temple in Mumbai, and that's a quotation from him.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for attributing that. I forgot the name. But as I was saying, like things like brahmacharya and sexual restraint and harm and self-harm, those are all things that I started to permeate into me. When I first got into yoga, all five of those yamas were not things I necessarily practiced, but I found it so interesting that as I got into that social environment, in a way, like I would say, like my frequency changed. And for me, that's why I want people to find some way, whatever it is, make yoga accessible so that people can do that, because I feel like so many problems in society would be solved if people got into yoga and started to adopt these different ways that they have interpersonal interactions that are more thoughtful, loving, and respectful. And so, one thing I wanted to ask you on, talk to you on, was going a little bit deeper into actually one of the niyamas and the Ishvara Pranihana. And a lot of times that's talked about as something that is a surrender to God, but you addressed it also as like if you're not theistic, it's a surrender to the unknown. Is that something that you've picked up through, kind of your research and who you've studied underneath, or is that something that just isn't addressed as much?
First of all, I love what you said about changing your frequency. Um, you said that you're practicing and it just changed your frequency. That's such an awesome way of describing what happens. We really are, we're patterns, and patterns are made up of frequencies, different rates of vibration. That's what a frequency is. And like literally, that's what we're doing. We're tuning ourselves to these more refined, open, aware states of vibration, really. And so it's really nice what you said. I like that a lot. So in regards to Ishvara Pranidhana, you know, Patanjali gives this idea of Ishvara Pranidhana as a choice, because there are all these things in chapter 1 where he ends the sentence with the word va, which means or. And after Ishvara Pranidhana, he describes what Ishvara is. Um, and he said it's a particular type of person who is untouched by karma, first klesha, or any of the obstructions to self-knowledge. So Purusha, this Ishvara, fully knows itself. And then it doesn't act, and because it doesn't act, it doesn't suffer from the effects of actions, the karma pala. And therefore it's free from all of that. But we're touched by klesha, and we act, and we suffer from the effect of action, so we suffer. So therefore, this Ishvara is a being that has never suffered and never acted. And all action exists within time and space. And because there's nothing within time that doesn't act. If it is within time, then it has to suffer from progression of sequence. And therefore, anything which is doesn't suffer from that or is not bound by it is therefore by definition outside of time and outside of space. And then Patanjali goes on to say that in the next verse, that he's kalena anavacheda. He stands outside of time, and therefore was the teacher of even the ancients. He was the timeless being that even the ancients somehow came into contact with, and then knew who they were. And then that teaching was passed down to us. So for theistic people, you could call this God. But there are some people who are not theistic. And also the Yoga Sutra is based on the Sankhya philosophy. The Sankhya philosophy in Hinduism is a non-theistic philosophy. And so therefore, it would just seem to make sense that there's an option for having a relationship with Ishvara that is not based on God as creator or God as anything, but just as timeless being. And since it's timeless being, which means outside of time and space, but just pure existence, this is something that we can't know with our mind because it stands outside of our mind. Our mind is a product of maybe its emanation, something other emanation. So therefore, it is unknown to us. And so by surrendering to this unknown or having faith in the unknown, we can also practice Ishvara Pranidhana. It seems to be that people who don't believe in God, or they're not sure if they do, they can still get behind surrendering to the unknown. We don't know what the next minute is going to bring. We don't even know if the next minute is going to occur. We just assume that it does. And by assuming that the next minute is going to occur, then we continue to lock ourselves into being trapped by the succession of moments that make up time. And then we stay stuck in illusory everything. But if we surrender to the unknown, go, I don't know if the next minute's going to happen or even what it will bring. And I'll still plan my life and make my to-do list, but it's not going to define my being because simply I don't know what any of my actions will bring. So I'll do them as fully as they flow through me. So what happens is, number one, you surrender to the unknown, and you also kind of surrender to flow, like things will unfold or not unfold, and it's not entirely under my control. So you don't give up, as I said in the book, we don't give up all agency of our lives, but we give up the idea that I am the agent of all the things that happen. And if we give up this agency that I am responsible for all the things that happen to me, then all of that releases a lot of pressure and a lot of burden from us, because maybe some bad things have happened to us that we think are our fault, but maybe they're not our fault. It's part of this unknown. We don't know why these things have happened. So that can free us up of the burden of taking things on our shoulders, which we're not responsible for, which we didn't do. Maybe we're done to us or done by others. So there's a lot of sort of interesting psychological unfolding that can happen from saying, I have control over a certain amount. There's also a lot that I have no control over. And to that, I'm just going to surrender.
Two things in that I really like. One, when I was initially getting into yoga, I was a little hesitant because I thought it was a religion. And a lot of times in the book, I might be wording this wrong, but it's like these are not guidelines, but you're encouraged to do these things. And so the idea that whatever it is that you're surrendering to, when you articulate it that way, I was like, okay, this makes it more accessible because it's principles and it's things that you see in every religion, kind of how you were talking about postures. You see it in every different religion. It's just named and articulated and organized a little bit differently within yoga. But then when you talk about not having to hold on to things, for me, and I know for a lot of people, when you hold on to either stories or you're like, why did this happen? You're trying to figure it out. But as soon as you let go, then you're able to just kind of be and just kind of reduce some of that maybe anxiety or stress and things that from a mental perspective kind of weigh you down. So I really like that. And I'm glad that I'm thankful that you went a little bit deeper into that. One of the next things I kind of want to chat about, section where you talk about who am I, what am I doing here, and what should I do next, and kind of how that relates to identity. And in yoga a lot you talk about like not being super attached to, oh, I'm this or I'm that. But are there times when having an identity and saying I am a mother or I am a father is beneficial?
Yes, definitely. And a lot of the identities that we have um, are are important for the jobs that we have to do. So the first place I heard this, who am I, what am I doing here, what do I do next, is from my ninth grade English teacher, Mrs. Jane Benditson. And we were reading Siddhartha in ninth grade. And I was a little bit of, I was out of place in high school. I switched schools from a hippie, little school in Greenwich Village in New York, and then gone to sort of this private school that was an hour away. And I was a little bit of like, hippie turning into a punk rocker, and I was out of place and quite lost in my life. And so she said this thing in English class, and it was like, just, it wasn't a light bulb went out off in my mind. It was like, I was sort of shaken up, like, yeah, who the fuck am I? Seriously, that's a good question. Finally, I hated school. I hated it. And it's like literally the only thing I remember from high school is are those three things. And that began to guide me, that I thought, well, I don't really know who I am, but what I can do is I can really embody these false roles that I'm playing the best I can. And I'll try to play them out fully and see what happens. And so when I was a punk rocker, or if I was a hippie, or if I was trying to be an artist or a musician, I gave myself to those roles fully as an idea of like, who am I trying to be this thing? And then how do I act in regards to it? So that even if it's a false narrative, I do that false narrative the best I can.
Mm.
That's kind of what I did. And so you're allowed to change roles, you're allowed to change narratives, but what you want to do is you want to live that narrative as authentically as you can. And so that's how I initially took that reading. Mrs. Benditson, she was great. I got in trouble in 11th grade. I lost my wallet, and they found it on the school bus, and went looking through it to see who it belonged to, and they found that it belonged to me, and they also found about, I don't know, $50 worth of cocaine in it as well. So that like wasn't so good. I got called into the principal's office, and they decided to not re-invite me back to the school the next year. And Mrs. Benditson, who was the strictest teacher I ever had, was the only person in the entire school who stood up for me, the only person. And then, she followed me like through when I had to change schools. And then she came to check up on me every once in a while. And she cared, she was great. So when I got to India and I read Who Am I from Ramana Maharshi, I thought, oh my God, this is exactly what she was talking about. And she had planted these seeds in me of questioning this years before I ever got to India. So, a bunch of years ago, I wanted to track her down to thank her for all this. I looked her up, and she had died like just 3 or 4 months earlier.
It's super interesting how we won't go into it a ton, but on other podcasts or things I've listened to, you had this complete 180, and kind of when you talk about like $50 of cocaine, punk rocker, hippie, into now, an Ashtanga yoga teacher. And it's almost like you were on one side of the spectrum and now you're on the other side of the spectrum. And I see that a lot, where people will go from maybe not rock bottom in this case, but it helps catapult them into on the other side in order to help others.
I'm going to tell you something really funny, because I know where you're going with that. When I went from being a punk rocker into doing yoga and went to India in 1988 to like learn how to be a yoga teacher, for my parents, this was even worse. No one was doing yoga. And I mean, people were doing it. Yoga had been in America for a while, but this was not considered to be a respectable thing. This was like, is he joining a cult? Has he have drugs totally damaged his brain forever? Like, this was like probably even, they would come see my punk rock band at CBGB's. Running off to India to like go to an ashram. They didn't even know what that was. I might as well have been joining the Hare Krishnas and shaving my head. And so that was like not a well-respected thing to do. So I did not turn 180 degrees in their eyes or in anyone else's, or even only in mine. But now, because of the way culture has changed and adapted yoga into a consumeristic society, I have turned in the eyes of society as 180 degrees to have a respectable job. I say to people, yeah, I'm a yoga teacher. They go, oh, wow, you teach yoga. And that's like a respectable thing. But 30 years ago, that was like, you do what? You sell yogurt? So in my mind, I had cleaned up my act. The reason I cleaned it up was because I knew that the drugs and the music and all of that was part of a quest. I was seeking something. I was on a search for something. And that search was about expression. And expression is about being in touch with your creative self. The self is about embodying who you are. And, and embodying who you are means to know yourself. So without knowing it, I was on a search to know myself through these different narratives and through these different mediums. And we all go through those arcs. But when I found a direct path to doing that, that didn't require LSD or an electric guitar in a nightclub, I was pretty happy. Yeah, man, this is much easier, and I don't have to feel like shit the next day also.
Yeah, so is your body.
Yeah. So I know that, so I understand the question, and it seems like, and I wasn't an addict, because I quit drugs and drinking, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the so I know that wasn't the problem for me. And it wasn't like I turned 180 degrees. It was like, if there was 180 degrees, it was 180 degrees inward, where I thought, oh, now I've read some yoga books and they describe what it is that I want. These external things for that, and then I dropped those external things, meaning drinking and drugs and stuff like that. And then later the punk rock band stopped and all that. I think that's what you were going to ask, but
no, and I'm so glad you gave that distinction and went into a little bit more detail, because I think that alludes to something that's super interesting, and just the idea of self-study and continually, and that was your way of being like, who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing here? One of my favorite quotes is that yoga is the journey of the self, through the self, to the self. And what I found in my own practice is, the more I meditate, or in practice, I'm able to figure out, like, all right, that's a story from a family member, or that's something from society. This is what my soul is actually calling me to do. So I'm really glad that you did, like, it's in a way you didn't alienate that phase, because you were still on the path. You just hadn't, like, got super in line.
yeah, it was part of the path.
You spoke to something else that was interesting. You've been teaching for decades at this point, and you spoke to yoga's evolution. How has yoga, like, at what point did you see it coming, where yoga would become more commercialized? And in the book, you have a really good reference that yoga, you can think of as the Nile River. That water changes, that flows through it, and how people practice and how it's depicted will change as well. But as long as people are using it as a way of self-study and self-awareness, it's still for the good. One, I guess I'll ask, how has yoga changed, and how have you seen it change? And are there things that have gotten better as it's evolved, and are there things that have gotten worse?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the idea of yoga has been pretty constant for a few thousand years now, which is the desire to know who we are. And the yogis were not alone in that quest. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians and the Mayans and the American Indians and many cultures, um, they had that desire to know who they were and who the world was, and if there was a divine creator. Um, but the form of those things have changed as society as first of all, as the world has become more populated, as cities have developed, as societies got more complex, and as technologies evolved, the way that we practice things have evolved also. And we're in a time period now where yoga has been exploding, and it has been very consumeristic. But there were time periods like that in earlier as well, where yoga went through small revolutions or went through consumerist times too. We're just seeing more of it now because we're living through its arc. But in the earlier part of the 20th century in America, there was a big upswing in yoga for a while too. Richard Hittleman had a TV show on for many years, and Lilia Spolin had her TV show on for many years, and
Mm-hmm.
when people were first putting yoga on TV, I'm sure the yogis at that time, maybe the Indian swamis thought, this is really, what are Americans doing to yoga? This is really bad. So, and maybe the first time the yogis allowed themselves to be photographed, and those photographs were put in publications, other yogis might have looked at them and said, that guy's not really a yogi because he's letting his practice, which should be secret, be shown to the world. So, and maybe the first time a yogi came out from a cave and out from the forest and like went into a city and started, teaching people who were not monks, other yogis might have said, oh, that guy, he's totally lost it, man. He's come out from the cave. So, that probably happened also. So, what we're experiencing now is not new. It might be in a different form and it might be packaged differently. But I think that the search and the quest to know ourselves has been around in the same basic way for a really long time. One of the reasons I think that is because the mind that we have now is not very different than the mind that people had many thousands of years ago. And you read in the Yoga Sutras, which was written at latest estimations between 200 to 400 AD. So we're still going back almost 2,000 years. And the stuff that Patanjali is describing in there, the states of our mind and how the mind functions, that's how my mind functions now. I mean, I get distracted and I get confused and I get, really deluded. And sometimes I have moments of clarity. He's describing that. And so all the things that we experience now, they were experiencing then, which means that although times have changed and the way we live has changed, our mind really hasn't changed all that much. And so therefore, I take a lot of this like modern yoga stuff with a real grain of salt. A lot of it is academic. And though it has its value and has its place, I think that yoga is basically a good thing. I even think that goat yoga is a good thing. Even the hip hop yoga trends, even though I might not like the classes, I generally like the music. But I think that, all people need to do is hear this word yoga and think that they're doing yoga and have a desire to do more yoga. I think that's important. And some people say, oh, well, it's okay if they go to a hip hop yoga class because then later on they're going to desire something more deep and more real and more true. And my answer to that is, well, maybe for them, hip hop yoga is really deep and is really true. The teacher might not have deep levels of consciousness. Well, I don't either. And, maybe this teacher is just absolutely enough for them. And it makes them connect inwardly. So I think that it's hard to judge from the outside what a person's inner experience is. And so these are my opinions of it. I think that, I do think that when you learn a system, say you do Shivananda yoga and you learn that, and that's what I was doing originally, you should learn that and teach it as it was taught to you and not mess around with the system. Because that system is the product of a yogi's experience, who they learned something through practicing in that way, and they're transmitting what they learned through the vehicle of their practice. So don't change it. If you do Bikram yoga, he had his own particular experience of yoga that he was transmitting through that sequence. Now, as much as he might have been a bad guy, you're not going to become like, a bad person for doing his 26 poses. That was his own problem. But the yoga itself is good. My teacher also, he has sexual abuse allegations against him. He's passed away 10 years ago. And there's a lot of turmoil and pain in our community right now. These were his defects as a human being, but the yoga he taught was very good. And so we continue to do that. And people shouldn't change it too much because as it is, it's quite good. So I think that within particular systems, what a teacher is doing is passing down their experience through that particular vessel. Don't change the vessel. Have your own experience. And if your own experience is different and you feel the need to change something, don't call it that thing anymore. Call it like your own thing or whatever. But make sure that your experience is aligning with what the yoga texts tell you the results of your practice are going to be. I believe in creativity. I'm all for evolution. I'm all for innovation. Change is to be expected. But there are some things which work. Things that work might be ancient. And when you learn them, if they work, keep them like that. Don't mess around with them. We don't need to. Um, so that's my feeling on, like, what you might call tradition versus, and I think tradition's a really cheap word. I won't use it. I just think it's so cheap. It makes you sound like something which is traditional, has been around forever. And the definition of the word tradition means something that's only been passed down for one generation. So, like, if grandmother made a really good apple pie at Thanksgiving and taught that to your mom, and your mom taught it to you, that's your traditional apple pie for Thanksgiving. And you say traditional, it sounds like it's been around since the Pilgrims landed from the Mayflower. It hasn't been. So I think it's a dangerous word to use for most people. Okay, so state of yoga today. There's a lot of stuff going on out there. I haven't seen all of it. I've tried some. There's some of it that I really think is not very good. Like, I went to a core power yoga class and I thought, this is a really intense cardio class, but I don't see a whole lot of yoga in here. I just see a lot of cardio. So I don't know, like, if really, at least the one, I only went to one class. I should try another to see how that is. I didn't see a whole lot of, like, yoga in there, like identifiable yoga postures. A couple of warrior poses with weights. And I've been to a Bikram class, which I thought was quite good. And I've been to a few other classes here and there. Some of the vinyasa flow classes, I think some of them are a little too haphazard for my taste, and it seems like they're not all very anatomically intelligent with some of the things that are being done these days. So, but I think those are just postural things and physical things. But I think for even within those classes, the intentions of the teacher has been for people to connect to themselves and to be embodied, to be really aware of their bodies. And I think that that's a good thing, but not all the postures maybe are great for different anatomical what have you. Those are some of my, like, off the cuff observations. I think that generally speaking, we're in a pretty good place. And specifically speaking, it's always good to critique things within your own field of expertise, because that's how things get better. And that's very important to do. Even within my world of Ashtanga yoga, we need to be a little bit critical and allow people from the outside to criticize us too, and then listen to that and see where we need to make changes. Maybe not all the critiques are going to be valid or viable. Some of them will be, and we can be open to that, because that's how the field progresses, and we all get more benefit from it.
So you mentioned how the mind hasn't really changed from thousands of years ago. Do you think there's any credence in that the body is changing as we adapt to different postures with our phone and always being in the car and always being at a desk? And do different poses and postures need to reflect that change that's happening at anatomical level?
I think that also the body changes from the more there are people doing particular practices. The level of proficiency and skill with the body that I see in yoga now is a lot higher than it was 30 years ago. But I think that's just because there are a lot more people practicing. There were always a few people who could do some really cool things. Now there are tons of people doing things, And so I think that the more there are people doing it, the more the anatomical skill increases globally, because more people are inspired to kind of push themselves, and then they see, oh wow, I can actually do that too. So I was looking around. I was teaching in China a couple weeks ago, and I had a class of 140 people in the workshop. And I was looking around, I was like, every single person here can do lotus position. That's impressive. Everyone except for maybe 2 or 3 people can do Marichasana D. That's impressive. That's a hard pose to do. And maybe 20 years ago, I would look around at a class that size and maybe only half of the people would be doing the pose properly, or would be able to do the pose, and everyone else would be struggling or doing a variation of it. So I definitely see that the facility of people is improving all across the board. And my guess is it's because there are more people doing it. And as they see what the poses are, they're inspired to challenge themselves and find that they can do things that they didn't think they could do. And that's encouraging.
And I think YouTube and social media too, in a way, might help with that. Where there's rather than having to take a workshop to get into a certain pose, you have those steps that you can follow. And if someone's inspired by that, they can move that way.
Yoga Journal survey of how many Americans were doing yoga, the 35 or 36 million people. I mean, we have to take those numbers also with a grain of salt because a lot of those are maybe they've done it once or they did it once and they're never planning on doing it again. But I think about half of those people, according to this survey, do yoga at home from the internet or from a DVD. So exactly like what you said, you can learn a lot on your own. I was learning a lot from books when I was first practicing yoga.
It's crazy how much it's all evolved, even just since the iPhone came out 11 years ago. There's a couple other things I want to ask before I let you go. And one of them was you talk about beginners in the different states of restless, stupefied, distracted. And I believe you said distracted state's the best state for someone to get into it. And I found that super interesting because when I've interviewed other people who talk about their journey into yoga, they said, they didn't find yoga, yoga found them. And it was a timing thing. Is there a way to get people from restless or stupefied into distracted, or do they need to kind of get there on their own through their own self-awareness?
Um, you know, those five states, we can cycle in and out of them. And some people have a prevalence towards one state more than the other. And so someone who has sort of a stupefied state of mind, they still will be able to focus for periods of time. But the predominant nature of their mind might be to be really obsessive about something. So what I've seen over time is that people in the first two states who I know really never do yoga. They just have, these are just the small sample size of the people in my life who, they have a harder time getting to a yoga class because it's more difficult to be consistent with it. And so, are you locked into a category with those things? Not necessarily, but there might be other things that you will end up doing rather than yoga or spiritual practice.
So the distracted state, though, is a little bit more accessible because they're seeking a little bit more awareness.
Well, yeah, the distracted state isn't the best state. The distracted state is the state of mind of most spiritual practitioners. And the reason is distraction means sometimes you can pay attention, sometimes your mind wanders. And then after your mind wanders, you're going to recognize that you need to focus again and you're able to do that. So when you're doing your yoga postures in class or at home, sometimes you're paying attention to what you're doing, and sometimes you're thinking of something else. And then every once in a while, I go, oh, I'm going to pay attention to my body again, my back. So that ability, when it's strengthened and worked with consciously, can deepen into the next state of mind. So from a distracted state of mind, you can move towards one-pointed focus. But it's difficult from obsessive compulsive state of mind to move into a distracted state of mind to move into one-pointed focus. It's just a little harder. So the reason the distracted state of mind is simply because you are aware of what it feels like to be focused, to pay attention, or to sense awareness within you, to be aware of awareness. That can occur in distracted state of mind. It's just not a continuous state. You're going to leave that state fairly quickly. And then you're going to think to yourself, I would really like to be in that state of awareness more. And then you're going to go to yoga, you're going to go to meditation, you're going to do something, you're going to look for something that helps you to maintain that state more and more. Krishna said in the Gita that, if we've done yoga in a past life, we'll be drawn to it in this life as if by a magnet against our own will. Looking for, it's a search that draws us to yoga. And if we're not seeking, we're not going to do yoga.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I'm glad I got a little bit more, I guess, explanation of what you were talking about in that book. You talk about states and traits a lot. And I like thinking of states as weather patterns. So you're angry, you're sad, you're happy, you're elated, you want to punch someone in the face, is, clouds, rainstorms, thunderstorms, sunny. But then you talk about traits of calm, being empathetic. How can things like meditation or yoga help you get into those, or kind of strengthen those traits a little bit more, so that regardless of if things are going really bad, you still have this foundation, you're still a little bit more rooted with specific traits?
So the states and traits is something that I was inspired by Dr. Rick Hanson, and he's written a couple of really wonderful books. One is called Hardwiring Happiness. The other is called The Buddha's Brain, and he has another coming out next year. He's a wonderful scientist and psychologist. Um, so you can think about this, and this is how they describe it in all the meditation traditions, as the ocean. And on the surface of the ocean, you get waves, and the waves are changing states. And what are some of the things that are driving the waves? But weather patterns. If it's really windy out, then you get stronger waves. If there's no wind, then the waves are going to calm down. And so the wind is going to be like external environment. What's happening in our lives, the pressures from our life are going to blow our way, and then the waves are going to come up. Those are our thoughts. But the waves are not separate from the ocean. What is the ocean? But the ocean is the ocean of being, of consciousness, of awareness. And deep, deep down in the depths of the ocean, the currents are very slow. They're not as strong. Things are quiet, dark, or whatever. So you can think that below the waves of the mind, we have this depth, which is quiet. It's not moving all that much. And so you want to develop, and that's the trait, that's a character trait of the mind, of quiet, or of calm, or of compassion, or of kindness. And that becomes an underlying thing, so that even when there are waves occurring, our thoughts are occurring, and they might be troublesome or difficult, we also already formed a relationship with this underlying characteristic of calm or quiet that we can fall back on because we know that it's there inside of us. So a meditation takes you from the waves of the mind, so you dive deep down into the depths of quiet, calm consciousness or awareness that isn't moving that much, still.
Can this be compared to, as well as, like, the different parts of the brain, and how, if you if you have the trait of being calm or relaxed, you're able to use your prefrontal cortex, and as opposed to getting really stressed out, and basically handle those impulses as they come in, and be able to digest them a little bit more from a responsive state than a reactive state?
That's one of the good things about meditation and about yoga, is that it gets you in touch with these deeper levels of our being. And then what that does is that changes the way information flows are occurring in the brain. So our brain is not creating, at least according to yoga and Vedanta, our brain is not creating these states of consciousness or anything like that. But consciousness is using the mind to know itself, and the mind uses the brain also to know itself as well. So consciousness creates matter, creates the mind, creates the brain, creates the body, creates the world, or manifests as the world. And everything is sort of like a projection forward of these subtler types of things. So that consciousness is the support of all manifestation. So our brain is not creating states of consciousness. States of consciousness are reflected through the medium of the brain. The brain is like a transceiver of information, and it's processing it in different ways. So if you change the underlying signals, the way that it's processed on a physical level, then is going to reflect differently. You're tuning a radio station. Sometimes you get buzz, and then you hit, right on the station, and the music comes through clear. So the radio is not creating the music. The radio is just picking up the radio waves that is carrying the music, and then playing it through the speaker and all the electrical equipment which is gone, put together, however they do it to create that. So they say that our brain is kind of like the receiver and the actual physical implementation of, say, like a radio, not like a computer, which is programmed necessarily. And and that the energetic waves that are coming through that are emitted from consciousness. I didn't explain that very well, but it was close enough for jazz.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting for me, and I can only speak to my personal experience, but as I started to meditate more and made it more of a daily practice, I noticed different things within myself that changed. I used to say whatever would come to mind. First thing that would come to mind, I had people that you have no filter. And I've started to develop a filter. And I'm like, wow, like this is something that I thought I was just like, this is who I am. I'm someone who just says it. And then I'm like, oh shit, didn't mean to say that. But now I'm noticing that I have a little bit more restraint. And so it was kind of cool having you articulate that in a different way. Because again, I can only speak from my specific experience.
No, that's a really good way of putting it also. And so the we have top-down effect and we have bottom-up effect. The neurophysiological is bottom down, meaning from the brainstem up to the heart. And then neurocognitive is from the top levels of like prefrontal cortex down towards the physiological systems. So you do postures and breathing, and the physicalist practice like that, as well as vocalization. And what you're doing is you're balancing the functions of the brainstem so that it affects function going up through the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. Meditation, behavior, conscious awareness is starting at the prefrontal cortex, and then as you what you're doing is you're doing practices that is harmonizing the information flows in those areas, and then that trickles down to the limbic system and to the brainstem. So that if you do some meditation on a mantra or loving kindness or whatever, it changes your perception through the limbic system of threat in the world around you, lower your heart rate, give you better heart rate variability, and improve your digestion and help you sleep better, or brainstem functions. So this is top down. And then bottom up, postures going to regulate blood pressure, make you feel healthier, stronger, safer, have more energy. Breathing practices are going to tone the vagus nerve and blah, blah, blah. So in yoga, we have both of those things, which is great. We have top down, we have top down, and we have bottom up. And so, and what all of these things are doing is they are working on our information processing systems and making sure that information flows are smoothly going through them. And then when that happens, then it's easier for us to have a sense of our inner awareness. And then when we have this sense of our inner awareness, because we're not getting disturbed by peripheral things, peripheral things are really going to disturb us. But when you say, oh, I feel connected, that means I'm connected to my internal awareness, like things are aligned. And then this internal awareness then becomes the driver of the information flows. And the information flows go, how do I want to perceive this situation or this action or this thought? Is it in alignment with this inner sense of feeling that I have? And if it's not, then you don't do it anymore. And if it is, then you do it. And that process it's shown as processing in the brain, but it happens from awareness. It happens at a deeper level.
Yeah, I love in the back of your book, you have 4 different practices, and the loving kindness meditation is one that, for me, it makes so much sense because if you practice those things in a mental way, for me, it kind of translates to practicing like throwing a specific way. It's a movement pattern, but instead it's a thought pattern. And when you get stressed out, you go to whatever is grooved the most. So in sports, when you're stressed, you're going to go to whatever form you've grooved at the deepest level. When you're stressed mentally, you're going to respond to a positive perspective or to whatever trait is ingrained the deepest.
That's exactly it. A character trait is a learned habit through practice, and it's a practice of being aware. Any level of loving kindness, of breathing, of whatever the pattern is. But that's exactly it, what you just said.
Cool. Eddie, I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you again so much for coming on. And I'd like to just give you the opportunity to, one, promote your book, your website, anything else that you have as resources for people to check you out, now's the time. Share it with the people.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for that opportunity. Number one, I have a book out called One Simple Thing, a new look at the science of yoga and how it can transform your life. It came out in March. We're already going into our second printing. We sold out the first printing of 13,000 copies. And the second one should be out at the end of August, beginning of September. And then I have an app called the Breathing app, which is an app which will guide you in something called resonance breathing. It'll bring your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems into an equilibrium and begin to reset the sort of resiliency response of your nervous system. And so that's a free app. You can download that on Apple or the other one, Google Play. That's called the Breathing app. And then my website is eddiestern.com, and Instagram is the only social media that I use. And my Instagram name is Eddie Stern. That's my stuff right there.
Awesome. Love it. I also saw you, the little workshop you're doing with NYU.
Oh,
Forget the exact details.
That's called Engineering Health. And this is a free online yoga and physiology course. And it's you go to coursera.org and you can look for Engineering Health. And it will take you through the different major physiological systems and the yoga practices that will impact those systems.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, definitely want to check that out. I saw that and just haven't got into it yet. But again, Eddie, thank you so much for coming on. I'm honored and I learned a ton. My notebook is filled with stuff and I know other people learned a ton as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on.
That was Eddie Stern. So I 100% recommend One Simple Thing. I got an audiobook and a hard copy. Anyone that does yoga or is interested in the science behind yoga, I promise you this book is going to do wonders in illuminating and explaining a lot of that. Other than that, if you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to give it a 5-star rating and review. Subscribe to the podcast. Tag Eddie and I. Let us know that you're listening. And then head on over to downdogathletics.com for more podcasts, more blogs, resources on all things yoga, athletics, training. Got some nutrition on there as well. Sign up for the newsletter. And other than that, have an awesome rest of 2019. I got one more podcast for you guys in 2019 before we head into the new decade. Catch you next time on the Down Dog Athletics Podcast.